Thesis statement. Fetishizing potential is a bias that warps understanding of our world. It takes what could have been in some cases and puts it above what actually was. I'll provide examples as they go. Let's get started. Fallout New Vegas versus Fallout 4. Fallout New Vegas is, at least without mods, one of the buggiest games you will ever play. I mean, if you go on the wiki and just look at things that don't work on, I'll use the version I played, the Xbox One release, it is kind of ridiculous. Like, I remember the first time I played Fallout New Vegas back in like 2024, I kept having to pull up the wiki to check to see if the perk I was about to take actually worked, or if a questline was breaking because I was doing something wrong, or because the game just simply didn't work. That's not to say Fallout 4 is some game that has no glitches or bugs. Lord, no, that's not true. However, I do, at least in my personal subjective experience, feel like there are a lot less game-breaking bugs and glitches. That being said, there exists this concept among people who have played both, and I don't want to put everyone in this bucket, but I've definitely seen it amongst my friends, and I've definitely seen it on the internet. There are just people who put the idea of Fallout New Vegas with no bugs and more dev time above Fallout 4, even though I think Fallout 4 is a more complete game. And again, mods aside, you can ship of Obsidian, any Bethesda game or Obsidian game, and at that point you just have a brand new game that you need to judge on its own merits. However, what I'm talking about is the modern day console releases of these games. I do believe that if you're not careful, you will put this romanticized and idealized version of Fallout New Vegas where you just ignore the bugs because, you know, it's a feature, not a bug. And you ignore the fact that the lighting breaks sometimes. You ignore the fact the game crashes more than a release at that time should have. And you ignore the fact that perks don't work. And you have to use the wiki a lot. And you just kind of have to get used to a lot of the jank. And what you remember is how good the writing is. And you remember how good the quests that do work are. And you remember how well realized the world is. And you just take that and you just apply it to the whole game. That, in my mind, is a prime example of fetishizing potential. Whereas with Fallout 4, at least from my own personal subjective experience, I don't find people doing the same thing. Maybe it's because the writing in that game, while still very good in my opinion, is definitely like half a step, maybe a full step down from Fallout New Vegas. And I do find personally that the main quest of Fallout 4 is a lot less compelling than the main quest of Fallout New Vegas. It keeps the player moving with an objective towards the end game, which I think is a problem a lot of open world games face. But that is such a concept for a whole nother video. That being said, I still prefer Fallout New Vegas to Fallout 4. But that comes down to a lot more than me just thinking about the game and what it could have been versus what we actually got. The next example I'll give is kind of multifaceted. But start with, it's Michael Jordan. Which is so weird to say about what is potentially the greatest basketball player of all time, and who, in my opinion, has the greatest peak of any basketball player of all time. And say people like put the potential of what his career could have been over what actually happened. And what I'm primarily talking about is the 2 years he missed during the 90s. There's a sentiment among people I've talked to that essentially Michael Jordan would have just by default won those two championships because he's Michael Jordan, and we never saw him lose in the finals, and he never, went to a game 7 in the finals, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't believe that it can be taken as a given that the Bulls would have just 4 and 5-peated on their way to the second 3-peat, which in this hypothetical universe would have been an 8-peat. I don't think that can be taken as a given, both because of injuries and because of the aging of the core around him. I mean, no matter how good one individual player is, they cannot win a championship by themselves. And this is also ignoring the unfortunate real-world implications that MJ's dad died, which I think is probably the real reason he took some time off of basketball. But I think there's a sort of romanticizing of his career and mythologizing. There's a certain There's a certain aura around his career that just lends people to put what could very easily be the greatest basketball career of all time and make it even more than it was. That takes us to the other part of this equation I want to talk about, which is LeBron James. I don't want to talk about LeBron James. LeBron James has almost had to deal with the reverse side of the fetishizing of potential. Lord, I hate the fact that I called it the fetishizing of potential. We're calling it romanticizing from this point forward. Where, since he was, deemed as the chosen one at such a young age, the fact that he has become another arguably greatest player of all time is taken for complete granted. When you look at his career in its totality, I think what he's accomplished is insane. The fact that he is still somewhat within the range of a top 10 NBA player at 40 plus, and the fact that his career has now been legally allowed to drink for multiple years is just ridiculous. But he's almost a victim of his own hype train, where the fact that he only won 4 championships is used against him, which is wild because winning one NBA championship is insanely difficult. I mean, I'm a Memphis Grizzlies fan, and we've never been to the finals, and the closest we've ever gotten, multiple dominoes had to completely fall our way for us to even make the conference finals. And even then, when we got there, it wasn't exactly the most competitive series. So it's just wild to me that because LeBron James was deemed the chosen one, and the best player in the world for a long stretch of time, he was just automatically supposed to win championships because it ignores a ton of context surrounding those things. And then when you get into comparing Michael Jordan versus LeBron, it is one of the most futile conversations you can have because both sides over-romanticize their individual argument, and they almost do the inverse to the other. Because the way you almost have to view basketball is with ranges. I think everyone does this even if they don't realize it. Is there's a certain amount of, like, basketball is a team sport, injuries happen, shot variance is a real thing. So there's a certain inbuilt variance to the entire sport and to the entire, TV show. So when you talk about players' careers, you just have to take that into account. I think everyone does, even if they don't realize it. So when you get into arguments about Jordan and LeBron, the Jordan side takes his range as far as it will go and takes LeBron's as far back as it will go, and then the other side does the opposite. And so you have this like mind-numbing debate where neither side typically agrees that the other one has a valid argument, or neither side argues from a fair hill where you could both argue the highest possible range, you could both argue the lowest possible range, or you could both argue a median range and have a pretty valid argument. But that's just not what happens. The next, the last basketball example I'll give is Ben Simmons. Ben Simmons, in a way, could almost be viewed as like Perk Cousins of the NBA, but he got taken with the first overall pick, where Ben Simmons. In a way, the reverse version of what I talked about with LeBron, where because he was taken with the first overall pick, he had these massive expectations placed upon him, and it makes what he actually accomplished in his NBA career seem almost underwhelming. Even though if he had been taken with like the fifth or the sixth pick, or even the second probably, he would be viewed as like an awesome pick. Some of that has to do with like draft equity and the economics of picks, and I'll link to a video or two that explain all that if you find it interesting. But I think more of it has to do with the media side of things. Where I'm just going to read out Ben Simmons' accomplishments real quick. He's a 3-time All-Star, an all-defensive first-team player, and an all-NBA third team. If the Memphis Grizzlies drafted a player who accomplished those things, I would be so unbelievably excited, because that is a really good player. That is what Ben Simmons is. He, at one point, was a really good player, and by a general panel in the NBA, he was deemed as potentially around the 15th best player in the NBA. However, I don't want to say a lot of people view Ben Simmons as a bust because he had these almost franchise-saving expectations put on top of him, and then when he couldn't reach him, he began being demonized, and then at a certain point, something happened. I both don't want to give him a pass for kind of diffing on his team and forcing his way out. However, none of us actually know what happened, and so I'm just going to leave it at his career feels underwhelming, and for a first overall pick, he probably didn't meet expectations. But how much of that is on us as fans or the media for projecting these insane accomplishments onto an 18-year-old when they get drafted, and then when they can't meet those expectations, we call him a bust, and it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. The draft in general is just romanticizing of what players could be as much as it is an economic exercise. If you're, a general manager in the front office of a team, it's undoubtedly a lot more of an economic exercise than it is the latter. But as fans and as the media, I believe it's basically just trying to hype up a new wave of prospects. And to do that, you have to place these lofty expectations on them before they ever step foot in an NBA court. And in a way, you sign up for that when you agree to play in the NBA, and you do get pretty handsomely rewarded, but still. An example of this in pop culture is Nirvana. Nirvana is a very interesting band to me as someone who was not alive during the band's existence. Because Nirvana has some of the greatest highs of any band I've ever listened to, and also some of the lowest lows. Their albums go from like all time encapsulations of what it is to be a human with music like Teen Spirit to like just complete screaming at the mic. They almost never bring up the fact that Nirvana as a band probably would not have continued to exist because of all the turmoil the band was going through, regardless of what happened with Kurt Cobain. However, when people, at least in my experience, talk about Nirvana, they project that Nirvana would have continued to make all-time great songs into the future, which I'm not even saying wouldn't have happened. We have no idea. That's not the world we live in. All I'm saying is we don't know. And to act like it was a guarantee is, I think, intellectually dishonest, or at least to not acknowledge that it's a possibility that it wouldn't have happened. Hopefully one of those examples resonated with you. It's why I brought out so many. The reason I bring all this up isn't to try to change your opinion on any of those things. My point was never, you can't think Michael Jordan's the best basketball player, or you know, Fallout 4 is objectively better than New Vegas. That's not my point at all. Believe whatever you want to believe. What I was trying to point out is how our culture seems to hype up these things to the point where they're no longer dealing in reality. Where events become so mythologized and so hyped that they lose touch with what actually made them great. I think in Fallout New Vegas' case, because it's the most evident, it's putting that game up as one of the greatest games ever, but not acknowledging that it has some pretty major faults. And it's not that you can't put it on that pedestal. You just need to acknowledge that that game has serious flaws. Same thing with like Michael Jordan versus LeBron. You can think whatever you want to about those basketball players. You just have to acknowledge that there's kind of ranges for both of their careers. And to act like any of the events in their careers were just predetermined and were always going to play out that way is to not fully understand the amount of work both of those individuals had to put into to be as great as they were. Not to mention how much teamwork was needed, how much coaching was needed, and how many marbles had to ultimately fall their way for both of their careers to play out that way. I very quickly want to bring up Plato's theory of forms. I'll throw up a big box of a lot more in depth of what his theory of forms is and try to find a video that gives the information a lot more gravity and a lot more time than I will. But in short, the ideal version of a thing is more real and more viable than any particular version we encounter. I want to reframe that idea back to the thesis statement. And simply put, we often treat a person or a project's potential as more important or more real than what they actually did. And it leads to this disconnect from reality, where we're more influenced by something's potential or something's hype than what you can actually hold in your hand or what you can actually hear in the music or what you can actually see them do. And then we treat it like it's a fact. Like something's potential is the same thing as what it is, even though those are two completely separate things. Sometimes they align and sometimes they don't. And when they don't, we treat it as if it's that thing's fault for gaining the hype or gaining the potential or not reaching its potential, even though there are most commonly factors outside of whatever ideas or things control. Yeah, I think that's about it. Beware the hype, I guess. Try to value what something is in that moment more than what it could be. I think it leads to a certain disconnect from reality if you just continuously ignore what something actually is. And and that's dangerous. I don't want to fearmonger or make this more than it is. It's just something I noticed. It's something I wanted to talk about. If you enjoyed this, and I really hope you did, leave a comment. I really want to know what other people think about this video. And I hope it leads to a lot of cool discussions. Share this with a friend to see what they think. I think this is a fascinating concept. I don't even think I'm intrinsically correct. I just think I'm on to something, and I think the idea needs more refinement. And I hope people will do that with me. That being said, maybe I'll make more of these, maybe I won't.